Ever get the feeling that we're all just kind of walking around with like all these beliefs?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And we don't even really know where they came from? You know,
Yeah.
like how much have we actually stopped and thought about them?
Totally.
It's like life just throws all this stuff at you. You know, you grow up a certain way, you see stuff in the news, you talk to people.
Right.
And you just kind of soak it all in. And then one day you wake up and you're like, wait, why do I think this?
Yeah, it's kind of like on autopilot, right?
Totally autopilot. And for people like our listeners, you know, people who really want to get to the bottom of things, it's tough, right? We can't all be experts in absolutely everything.
Yeah, you just don't have the time.
You don't have the time. There's just too much out there. So we've been thinking a lot about this, and we've come up with something we call the cognitive compass.
Yeah, that sounds interesting.
Right. It's a framework to help you think about, well, how to think.
Oh, okay.
Now, and I want to emphasize this isn't about telling you what to believe.
Right.
Not at all. It's about how to form your own beliefs.
Giving you the tools.
The tools, exactly.
The toolkit, yeah.
So you can be more effective. You can be more efficient in figuring things out for yourself.
Kind of like a shortcut to clearer thinking.
It is a shortcut, yeah. That's a great way to put it. And the way it works is we look at any question, any big question, from 3 different perspectives, 3 different lenses.
Okay, so kind of triangulating the truth.
That's it. Triangulating, that's perfect.
I like that.
So the first lens is, well, it's kind of 2 things.
Okay.
It's sociology and psychology.
Gotcha.
And what we're looking at there is human behavior, right? Like, how do we act as individuals? How do we act in groups? What are the systems we build?
The stories we tell ourselves.
Yes, and emotions. How do those play into it all?
That's huge, right? Emotions drive so much.
They do. They really do. Okay, second lens, science.
The classic.
The classic. This is the observable universe.
What we can measure, what we can test.
Exactly. Cause and effect.
Right.
The things we can prove.
That's where the hard data comes in.
Hard data. And then the third lens, this is where it gets really interesting, abstract philosophy.
Okay, getting deep now.
This is where we deal with the why questions, the big ones.
Like the meaning of life type stuff.
That's exactly it. The meaning of life. What is reality? Is there ethics? Are there morals? What's possible? What's impossible?
The stuff science can't quite answer yet.
Or maybe can never answer.
Maybe. It's pretty exciting, though, to think
Oh,
about.
it's so exciting. And, you know, what we found is by looking at things this way, by using all 3 of these lenses, we start to see things differently.
You see the whole picture?
We see inconsistencies. We challenge our own biases.
And we come to better conclusions, right?
Yeah. It's not about just being right or wrong. It's about having that intellectual humility. You know, being open to being wrong. Being open to being surprised.
Being willing to change your mind.
Yes. That's what it's all about. So in this deep dive, that's what we're going to do. We're going to take some of these really big questions, the ones everyone thinks about,
Right.
and we're going to run them through the cognitive compass.
That'd be fascinating.
So let's dive in. First question, the one everyone asks at some point. How did the universe begin and why?
All right. Big one right out of the gate.
It is. It is. So first things first, let's put on our science lens.
All right. Looking at the data, what do we know?
What do we know?
Well, the prevailing scientific theory, the one that seems to fit the evidence best, is the Big Bang.
Okay, the Big Bang.
Right. Basically, it says that the universe started as this incredibly hot, dense point. A singularity, they call it.
A singularity.
About 13.8 billion years ago. And then, boom,
Right.
everything started expanding and cooling.
That's how space and time and matter and energy all got started.
That's the idea. And there's some pretty compelling evidence for it, too.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, there's this thing called the cosmic microwave background radiation. It's basically leftover heat from the Big Bang. And then you've got the redshift of galaxies, which shows the universe is still expanding.
Redshift.
Think of it like, you know, when an ambulance drives past you.
Okay.
The siren sounds higher pitched as it comes towards you and then lower pitched as it goes away, right?
Yeah.
It's like that with light. As galaxies move away from us, their light stretches out. It shifts toward the red end of the spectrum.
So it's like the sound of the universe stretching out as it expands.
Exactly.
Well,
And the amount of redshift we see tells us how fast it's expanding. Plus, there's the abundance of light elements like hydrogen and helium in the early universe, which matches the predictions of the Big Bang theory. So all these things point towards this picture of a universe with a finite beginning, which is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it, right?
It is. So from the science perspective, that's how it happened. But does science tell us why it happened?
Well, that's where things get a bit tricky. The Big Bang theory explains the evolution of the universe after it began, but it doesn't really address what came before the singularity or what caused it to happen in the first place.
So it's like we know the story from chapter 2 onwards, but we're missing that first chapter.
Yeah, it's like we walked in halfway through the movie. There are some hypotheses, like the idea of a multiverse, where our universe is just one of many, or cyclical models, where the universe goes through endless cycles of expansion and contraction, big bangs and big crunches.
Whoa.
But right now, we just don't have the tools to test those ideas directly.
Okay, so science gives us the how, but not necessarily the why.
Exactly.
So let's shift gears a bit. Let's put on our sociology and psychology lens and ask, why do we even care about the beginning of the universe?
Right. Like, why is this question so important to us?
Why do we need origin stories?
Well, it seems like we're hardwired to seek out these explanations.
Like it's built into us.
Yeah. And I think it's because knowing where we come from gives us a sense of grounding, a sense of identity, maybe even a sense of purpose.
Like a place in the world.
Exactly. It helps us make sense of our own existence. And you see this need reflected in all these cultural narratives that humans have created throughout history.
You mean like creation myths?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Genesis, the Big Bang, indigenous cosmologies, all sorts of different stories that explain how everything began.
And it's not just about the beginning, is it? It's about the end, too.
That's right. Whether it's heaven, reincarnation, apocalypse, we have all these ideas about where we go after this life. It's like we need that sense of a complete story.
It's the narrative arc of existence.
Exactly. And psychologically, we seem to be much more comfortable with the idea of a purposeful origin, even if it involves a deity or some complex cosmic process, than just accepting that it might all be random.
So we prefer meaning, even if it's made up.
In a way, yeah. It helps us deal with that existential anxiety. It makes the universe feel a little less chaotic.
Okay, so that's the human element of it all. But what happens when we look at this through the lens of abstract philosophy?
Oh, this is where it gets really heady.
I love it.
Philosophers have been grappling with the origin of the universe for, well, basically forever.
Oh, yeah.
And they get into these really deep fundamental concepts, like causality, for example. The idea that every event has a cause.
Okay, so that would mean something had to cause the Big Bang.
Right. But then the question becomes, what caused that cause?
Right.
And what caused that one? It's like an infinite regress.
It makes your head spin a little.
Definitely. And then there's the idea of necessity versus contingency. Is the universe something that had to exist, or is it just an accident, a fluke?
So was it inevitable, or could it have easily not happened at all?
Exactly. That's a big one. And it leads to questions like the first mover argument.
What's that?
Well, it goes back to the idea that everything needs a cause. So if we trace back the chain of causes, there must be some uncaused first cause, right? And many people identify that first cause with God or some other fundamental principle. But philosophy also questions these assumptions. Like, does the principle of causality even apply to the universe as a whole? Is it possible for something to just come into being without a prior cause?
Yeah.
And some even go so far as to question whether the concept of why even makes sense in this context.
You mean like why is a human question that we're imposing on the universe?
Exactly. It might not be a question the universe itself can answer. So philosophy pushes us to really think critically about the very questions we're asking.
So if we take all three lenses, science, sociology, psychology, and philosophy, and look at them together, what do we see?
Well, we see that science does a great job of explaining how the universe evolved after the Big Bang, but it's still grappling with the ultimate cause.
Right.
And we see that we humans have this deep-seated need for origin stories. But that doesn't necessarily mean those stories are true in any objective sense. And finally, philosophy reminds us that even our most fundamental concepts, like causality and why, might not apply to the universe as a whole.
So ultimately, it's a mystery.
It might very well be.
Yeah.
But it's a mystery that's worth exploring from all these different angles.
Okay, let's move on to another big question, one that feels especially relevant today.
Okay, hit me.
What is truth, and can humans actually perceive it accurately?
Wow, that's a huge one. And yeah, it feels more important than ever right now.
It does. So let's start with the science lens again. What does science tell us about how we perceive the world around us?
Well, it starts with our senses. Sight, sound, touch, smell, taste, all that. They're gathering data from the environment constantly.
Okay, so it's like our senses are little data collectors.
Exactly, and they're sending all that data to the brain, which then processes it, interprets it, and constructs our conscious experience of reality.
So we're not just passively receiving information, we're actively creating our perception of it.
Exactly. It's a very active process.
Huh.
And there are limits to what our senses can detect, right?
Like we can't see everything.
Right. We only see a tiny sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. We can't see ultraviolet light. We can't see infrared. And our brains are constantly filling in gaps, making assumptions, even editing what we see. Like, think about optical illusions.
Oh, yeah. Those things are wild.
They totally mess with your perception. And then there's the observer effect in quantum mechanics, which suggests that the act of observing something can actually influence what you observe.
Whoa. Really? So just by looking at something, we're changing it?
In the quantum realm, yeah, that seems to be the case. So from a scientific perspective, our perception is a really useful tool for navigating the world. But it's not a perfect, objective representation of reality. It's an interpretation.
And it's not just about our senses either, right? Don't we also have these things called cognitive biases that can distort how we process information?
Oh, absolutely. Our brains are amazing, but they're also prone to taking shortcuts. And those shortcuts can lead to some pretty systematic errors.
So even if we're taking in accurate data, our brains can still mess things up.
They can. Like confirmation bias, for example.
What's that?
It's the tendency to favor information that confirms what we already believe, and to be more critical of information that challenges those beliefs. We're all guilty of it to some extent.
So we're more likely to see what we want to see.
Kind of, yeah. And then there are framing effects, how information is presented, the words that are used, the context, all that can drastically influence how we interpret it.
So it's not just what's being said, it's how it's being said.
Precisely. And then there are heuristics, which are these mental shortcuts that we use to make quick decisions. They can be really helpful in a lot of situations, but they can also lead to biases and errors.
It's like our brains are trying to be efficient, but sometimes they sacrifice accuracy for speed.
Exactly. So yeah, from a scientific perspective, we have to acknowledge that our perception of truth is limited and influenced by all these biological and psychological factors.
Okay, so that's the science of how we perceive truth. But what about the social and cultural aspects of it?
Right. What happens when we put on our sociology and psychology lens?
What does truth look like from that perspective?
Well, one of the key things is that truth often becomes a matter of social agreement, of consensus.
So it's like truth by popular vote.
In a way, yeah. Each society or group develops its own set of norms, laws, beliefs, and those become the accepted truth within that group.
So different cultures could have very different ideas of what's true.
Absolutely. And even within a single culture, you can have different groups with different understandings of truth. It's about shared reality, about what makes sense within a particular community.
It's almost like truth becomes tribal in a way.
Yeah, you could say that. It's about belonging, about feeling like you're part of a group that shares your understanding of the world.
And that's where things like propaganda and media bias come in, right?
Totally. Those things are powerful forces that can shape how people see the world and what they accept as true.
It's like they're manipulating the narrative.
They can, yeah. And then there's education, too. That plays a huge role in shaping how we think and what we believe.
So the way we learn about the world can influence what we consider to be true.
Absolutely. And one more thing to consider here is the concept of emotional truth. Sometimes something can feel profoundly true to us on an emotional level, even if it contradicts the evidence or the accepted facts.
So there's a difference between what we feel to be true and what is actually true.
Right. And that difference can be really powerful, especially when it comes to things like beliefs and values.
Okay, so the social and psychological lens shows us that truth is a lot more complicated than just facts and evidence. There are these social and emotional layers that can influence how we perceive it.
Exactly. It's messy, it's subjective, and it's constantly being negotiated within and between different groups.
Okay, now let's put on our philosophy hat one last time.
Time for the deep dive into abstract truth.
What have philosophers had to say about the nature of truth?
Oh, they've come up with a ton of different theories over the centuries.
Like what?
Well, there's the correspondence theory, which is pretty straightforward. It says that a statement is true if it corresponds to reality.
Okay, so if it matches what's actually happening in the world.
Exactly. Then you have the coherence theory, which says that truth is about consistency. A belief is true if it fits in with our other beliefs and doesn't contradict them.
So it's like a puzzle piece that fits neatly into the bigger picture.
That's a good way to put it. And then there's the pragmatist theory, which says that truth is what works. A belief is true if it helps us achieve our goals, if it leads to beneficial outcomes.
So it's less about what's objectively true and more about what's practical.
Exactly. And of course, you can't talk about truth without mentioning postmodernism.
And what do postmodernists say?
Well, they often argue that truth is not some objective, universal thing, but is instead constructed by language, by power structures, by individual perspectives. It's fluid, it's unstable, and it's always changing depending on the context.
So truth is relative.
In a sense, yeah. It's not fixed or absolute. And philosophers also debate whether absolute truths even exist. Some point to things like mathematics and logic as examples of universal and unchanging truths.
2 plus 2 always equals 4.
Right. But others argue that even those are human constructs, limited by our own cognitive abilities and the frameworks we've created.
So maybe even math is just a way we make sense of the world, not necessarily an objective truth.
That's a possibility. And then there's epistemology, which is the branch of philosophy that deals with how we know what we know. It asks whether truth can exist independently of a human observer.
So can truth exist if there's no one to perceive it?
That's the big question, and it's one that philosophers have been wrestling with for a long time. Ultimately, I think the philosophical exploration of truth often leads to the conclusion that while objective truth might exist in some sense, our human access to it is always going to be limited and imperfect.
So we're always going to be seeing truth through our own particular lenses.
And acknowledging that is crucial if we want to be honest and rigorous in our pursuit of understanding.
Okay, so bringing those 3 lenses together, what do we know about truth and perception?
We know that science shows us how our senses and our brains can sometimes mislead us, that we're not always getting an accurate picture of reality. We know that sociology and psychology show us how social and cultural factors, as well as our own emotions, can influence what we perceive as true.
Right.
And we know that philosophy pushes us to question the very nature of truth, to be skeptical of absolute claims, and to acknowledge the limitations of our own understanding.
Now, it's complex.
It is. But it's also incredibly fascinating, and I think the more we explore these different perspectives, the better equipped we are to navigate the world and make informed decisions.
Okay, last question for this deep dive, and it's a personal one. What makes you you?
Oh, the age-old question of identity. I love it.
And is there even such a thing as a fixed self?
Right. Are we constantly changing, or is there some core essence that stays the same?
So let's start with the science lens. What's happening in the brain that creates the sense of self?
Well, your mind, your consciousness, your self-awareness, it all arises from the activity of your brain, that incredible network of billions of neurons.
Okay, so the brain is the hardware, and our sense of self is the software.
Kind of, yeah. And we know that physical changes to the brain through injury, disease, drugs, even just life experiences can profoundly affect who you are, how you think, how you feel, even your personality.
So our sense of self is very much a physical thing, not just some abstract idea.
It is. But here's the interesting part. Neuroscientists haven't found one single spot in the brain that's the self spot. It's not like there's a little you sitting in there somewhere.
No, it's not localized.
Right. Instead, our sense of self is thought to be an emergent property. It emerges from the complex interactions of all these different brain systems working together.
So it's like a symphony where the individual instruments don't make much sense on their own, but together they create something beautiful.
I like that analogy. And then there's neuroplasticity. This is the brain's ability to rewire itself, to form new connections and pathways throughout our lives based on our experiences.
So that means our brains, and therefore ourselves, are constantly changing.
Absolutely. It's not a fixed, static thing. Every new experience, every new piece of information, every new interaction can potentially reshape who you are. And there have even been fascinating studies with people who have had split brain surgery.
Tilt brain.
Yeah, where the connection between the 2 hemispheres of the brain is severed. And it seems like in some cases, these people can develop 2 distinct consciousnesses, almost 2 separate selves.
Whoa, so we might not even have just one self.
It's mind-blowing, right? So the scientific understanding of the self is that it's emergent, it's fluid, and it's constantly evolving.
Okay, so the you is a moving target, biologically speaking.
It is.
So let's shift to our sociology and psychology lens. How do our social interactions shape our sense of self?
Well, the concept of the social self is really important here. A big part of who we think we are comes from how other people see us.
So it's like we see ourselves reflected in the eyes of others.
Exactly. Our family, our friends, our culture, our social roles, all those things contribute to how we define ourselves.
And what about memory? How does that factor in?
Our memories play a huge role in creating our sense of self. We construct our personal narratives, our life stories, based on our memories. But memory is a tricky thing.
How so?
It's not a perfect recording of the past. It's selective, it can be distorted, and it's constantly being rewritten based on our current perspectives and emotions.
So the story we tell ourselves about who we are is always evolving.
It is. And we also have these different selves that we present in different social contexts. The way you act with your boss is probably different from the way you act with your friends.
So we adapt to our surroundings.
I do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a normal part of social interaction. But it does raise questions about whether there's any one true self.
It's like we're playing different roles in the play of life.
That's a good analogy. And then there are those really powerful life experiences like trauma or marginalization. They can have a huge impact on our sense of self.
So our identities are shaped by both the good and the bad things that happen to us.
Absolutely. It's all part of the mix. And the sociological and psychological perspective really emphasizes the fact that our identities are constantly being shaped and reshaped by these social interactions and experiences.
Okay, so our cells are a product of both nature and nurture.
Exactly. We're a combination of our biology and our environment, our genetics and our experiences.
One last time, let's put on our abstract philosophy lens.
Ready to get philosophical about the self.
What have philosophers had to say about this?
Well, as you might expect, they've raised some really fascinating and challenging questions.
Like what?
Well, there's this classic thought experiment called the ship of Theseus. Imagine you have a ship, and over time, you replace every single plank, every sail, every mast. Eventually, you've replaced every single part of the original ship. Is it still the same ship?
That's a tough one.
It is. And it gets to the heart of the question of identity. Like, if our bodies are constantly changing, if our cells are being replaced, are we still the same person?
So, like, are we the sum of our parts, or is there something more?
Exactly. And then there's David Hume, a famous philosopher who argued that the self is not this stable entity, but rather a bundle of constantly changing perceptions and sensations.
So like a river, always flowing, never the same from one moment to the next.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And then you have Eastern philosophies like Buddhism, which often talk about the self as an illusion.
An illusion, so there's no me at all.
Well, that's a bit of an oversimplification.
Yeah.
But the idea is that our attachment to this idea of a fixed self, of a separate me, is what causes suffering.
So maybe letting go of that idea of a fixed self is a path to liberation.
It could be. And then you have existentialist philosophers who say that we create our own selves through our choices and actions.
So we're not defined by our past or our biology, but by the choices we make in the present.
Exactly. We have the power to shape who we become. And I think a lot of the philosophical exploration of the self leads to this conclusion that the self is more of a process than a product, more of a verb than a noun.
It's an ongoing journey of becoming.
That's it. It's constantly evolving, constantly changing, and that's both exciting and a little scary.
So to wrap it up, what do our three lenses tell us about the mind and identity?
Well, science shows us that the self is a product of the brain. This incredible, complex organ that's constantly changing and adapting.
Right.
Sociology and psychology show us that our selves are also shaped by our social interactions, our experiences, and our memories. And philosophy pushes us to question whether there's even such a thing as a fixed self, suggesting that it might be more of an illusion or a process of becoming.
So in a way, the self is both everything and nothing.
It is. It's this complex interplay of biology, experience, and meaning-making. And I think the more we explore these different perspectives, the better we can understand ourselves and our place in the world.
This has been a really amazing deep dive.
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have, and it's really shown the power of the cognitive compass.
Absolutely. Just by looking at these big questions through these three lenses, we've been able to gain a much richer and more nuanced understanding.
So just to recap, the cognitive compass encourages us to look at things from the perspective of science, sociology and psychology, and abstract philosophy.
Right. And it's not about finding definitive answers. It's about developing better questions and being more critical in our thinking.
It's about being open to new ideas and being willing to change our minds when presented with new information.
Exactly. It's about embracing complexity and recognizing that there are often multiple valid perspectives on any given issue.
So as you go forward, consider this. Maybe the real goal isn't to find all the answers, but to keep asking questions.
I like that.
To keep exploring, to keep learning, and to keep growing.
And to remember that the journey itself is just as important as the destination.
Think about a belief you hold, something you're really sure about, and then ask yourself, How would you see it differently if you looked at it through these three lenses?
That's a great challenge. I think we could all benefit from that kind of reflection.
Absolutely. Keep that cognitive compass handy, and you never know what amazing discoveries you might make.
About the world and about yourself.
Exactly.